Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for attending today's webcast, Surviving Cold Weather Events, DemandSide Solutions to Winter Reliability Challenges. I'm Dan York, Senior Fellow in the Utilities and Local Policy Program at ACEEE, and will be the moderator for today's webcast. We'll start today's webcast with a few housekeeping announcements and then quickly move on to our presentation and discussion. As a reminder, your screen is customizable using the various widgets found at the bottom of your screen. Resources can be downloaded as PDFs from the resource list in the menu. Attendees are submit questions come to you. Presenters will be answering questions following all the presentations. The chat feature is enabled for you to share information ideas with others in the audience. I would like to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers. First, Mike Specian is a utility manager with ACEEE. Prior to joining ACEEE in 2020, Mike was a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow in the U.S. Department of Energy's Building Technologies Office. As a member of BTO's Emerging Technologies team, Mike facilitated behind-the-meter innovations to make buildings more energy efficient, resilient, and flexible for the evolving electricity grid. Mike holds a PhD in physics from Johns Hopkins University. Next is Maggie Shower, who is Director of Utility Reform at the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Maggie works to speed the clean energy transformation in the Southeast through analysis and advocacy. She has expertise in renewable energy, energy efficiency, coal retirements, energy market modeling, and transmission. Prior to SACE, Maggie advised energy companies and utilities as part of Navigant Consulting's energy practice. She holds a Master's of Energy and Environmental Policy from the University of Delaware and a BS in Physics and Environmental Studies from Allegheny College. Tom Hines is a principal at Tierra Resource Consultants. Tom is an energy efficiency expert with over 25 years of experience in demand-side management program design, implementation, and evaluation. He has successfully designed and managed multiple award-winning energy efficiency programs, including working as a strategic advisor on the design and development of Arizona Public Service's entire portfolio of DSM programs and supporting both APS and Duke Energy in their commitment to 100% clean energy. Tom was recently the principal author of Duke's Winter Peak Targeted DSM Study for North and South Carolina, as we'll be hearing from shortly. And then finally, Allison Silverstein is a consultant, strategist, researcher, and writer on electric transmission and reliability, energy efficiency, and technology adoption issues. She has worked for decades to advance the use of clean energy and advanced grid technologies as part of a reliable, resilient energy system. Allison has written seminal papers on electric system reliability and resilience and forward-looking power market design. Her work on major federal electricity efforts includes the U.S. Department of Energy's staff report on electric markets and reliability, 3 national transmission congestion studies, the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative Framework, and the industry-wide advancement of synchrophaser technology. Allison presently serves on the boards of ACEEE and the Health Alliance for Austin Musicians and lives in Austin, Texas. So clearly we've got a stellar panel. I'm very anxious to get going. So now on to the panel. It's clear that our electricity and other energy systems are undergoing fundamental transformations as we decarbonize the grid and incorporate a wide variety of smart, connected, efficient, and distributed technologies. One such transformation is electrification of current fossil fuel end uses, such as residential space and water heating, an important step in meeting local climate targets. Doing so will increase winter electricity demand, particularly for space heating. We have decades of experience in using demand-side solutions to reduce energy waste through improved efficiency and to manage peak demands, which for many U.S. utility systems occur in summer due to high air conditioning loads. Our grid resources are typically sized accordingly, meaning that meeting winter peaks demands are usually readily accommodated. As more utilities become winter peaking, however, the question arises of how we can best address these demands to ensure reliability and meet decarbonization goals. Today's topic is examining the use of demand-side resources to target and manage winter peak demands and constraints. Just over a year ago, ACEEE initiated a research project to analyze the question. The crisis experienced this past winter in Texas is a dramatic example of the devastation and hardships that can result when our grid and its resources fail. For today's webinar, Mike Specian of ACEEE will set the stage by presenting our analysis, which is covered in detail in an ACEEE research report released today. Maggie Shower will then provide perspectives from analyses of peak demand trends in the Southeast. Tom Hines will provide specific analysis of peak demand for one southern utility, Duke Energy of the Carolinas. Finally, Allison Silverstein will address the winter's crisis in Texas. And with that, I transfer it over to Mike to talk about ACEEE's analysis.
All right, thank you, Dan. Let me begin by just welcoming everyone watching live today, and greetings to you watching on this webinar on demand in the future. Before summarizing what's in the report, I just want to take a few minutes to discuss why a report like this is needed. Most people on the call today likely know that two key components to getting towards a net zero emission society are: one, decarbonizing the electricity supply, and two, electrifying building technologies that are currently powered by fossil fuels. And among these chiefly are space heating, water heating, and electric vehicles. So this transition, electrification, will have major impacts on our electricity system. If we replace, for example, natural gas furnaces and conventional air conditioning systems with electric heat pumps, two things are going to happen. One, because heat pumps can provide efficient cooling, summer electric load may drop, and as more solar energy is added to the grid, the net summer load that would be needed to be met with fossil fuels will continue to drop as well. And two, winter electric load will increase. The result is that regions of the country that are currently summer peaking, meaning that they experience their highest demand in summer, usually on the very hottest days, will become winter peaking. And if something like a polar vortex hits and delivers sub-zero temperatures for an extended period of time, you can wind up with a lot more winter electric load than there was beforehand, like sometimes in the order of 2 to 3 times more. And that's a challenge that we are going to have to collectively figure out how to handle. Now, right now, a small fraction of North American utilities already peak in winter, including many in the Pacific Northwest, some in the upper Midwest, Vermont, Canada, parts of the Southeast. But according to simulations from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory's Electrification Futures Study, whose results we leverage for our report, many states will trend toward becoming winter peaking by mid-century, including in locations like New England and the Mid-Atlantic. But even if a region doesn't become winter peaking, cold weather events can impose constraints on power generation as well. The impact of these events has been felt in the form of fuel shortages, spikes in energy prices, calls to shed load, rolling blackouts, and even loss of life, right? We saw this most recently in February in Texas. And while Texas experienced a record high level of winter demand, it didn't actually exceed the state's all-time summer peak. Nonetheless, and as we'll show in just a little bit, the challenges posed by events like these are just as amenable to demand-side solutions as those brought on by electrification. So in this particular report, we consider them in combination. Now, the reason that this matters is that summer and winter peaks are different in a number of ways. They are driven by different technologies, powered by different fuels. They occur at different times of day, and they last for different durations. In this figure, you can see in red how the summer peak runs from the early afternoon, or in the afternoon until the early evening, while the winter peak in blue is bimodal. So there's one peak in the morning and another in the evening. So it's not enough to say, let's just do what works in summer. We need to be mindful that the solution set for mitigating winter peaks and constraints is going to generally be different than mitigating summer peaks. And given that this is an emerging and growing issue, it's important to look at it now in order to be prepared for what is to come. So if we had to boil down this research report into a single question it seeks to answer, it would be, how can demand-side measures be used to mitigate winter peaks and constraints? And I just want to be clear about a point. we are not laying out or recommending in this report any roadmap for how electrification or the conversion of space heating to electric heat pumps ought to take place. Rather, our analysis starts with the presumption that winter peaks are going to be or are already an issue, and then we answer the question, so what can demand-side management do about it? And so for the next few minutes, I'd like to hone in on 3 sub-questions. First, what are the measures that should occupy our solution space, and which are the most important? 2, how can utilities and program administrators cost-effectively mitigate winter peak? And what level of savings can demand-side management provide? I mean, are we talking 1%, 10%, 50%? We'll try to get to that answer through a specific case study that I'll introduce in just a couple of moments. But let's start with those first 2 questions. Here's a list of some demand-side measures that we examine in this report. So these include installing higher efficiency air source heat pumps, as well as replacing existing heating systems with ground source heat pumps. We examine the benefits that can accrue from both basic building weatherization as well as deep energy retrofits. We look at the potential for intelligent thermal load management, which includes smart programmable thermostats in the case of residential buildings, and advanced HVAC controls and energy information management system in the case of commercial buildings. Of course, we take a look at savings achieved through lighting improvements. We consider the possibility of a utility or program administrator calling for load shedding in the form of a 2-degree reduction in temperature set points during very cold weather events. And we also look at some demand response measures, including shifting when grid interactive water heaters and electric vehicles are charging up, as well as the use of behind-the-meter battery storage to strategically charge and discharge to the grid. So in addition to describing each of these technologies and measures, we accompany most of them in the report with examples of utility demand-side management programs with the potential to mitigate winter peak. And we list over 20 such programs. And I'd like to recognize one of ACEEE's research analysts, Charlotte Cohn, for doing a great job in pulling these together. What we found, however, is that while the ability, as Dan mentioned, of energy efficiency and demand response to reduce summer peak demand is well proven through decades of utility program experience, using similar strategies to address winter peak demand, by contrast, is still emerging and largely untested. And I'll show in just a few minutes how we know that these measures can deliver winter peak savings. But first, I want to call attention to a specific heat pump financing program being run by Nova Scotia Power. So in the report, we identify programs like this and pull out the salient elements that we believe can serve as models for others who are looking to do something similar. So for this particular example, we provide details about how the utility works to bring contractors and customers together, how it sets up financing terms for heat pumps, how ownership is negotiated over time, progress that the program has made to date, which includes the impact of these installations on winter peak demand. The third of those 3 sub-questions was, what level of winter peak savings could demand-side management provide? And of course, there's no singular answer. The achievable savings depends on a region's particular circumstances. So what we did is looked around the country for a region that, 1, had a relatively high level and intensity of forecasted winter peaks, 2, the political and economic opportunity for demand-side management to be deployed at scale, and 3, the availability of historic and forecast data around energy use and avoided costs. We ultimately decided to look at New England in 2040, a time period by which the region is expected to become winter peaking. We began by constructing what we call an electrification scenario. The scenario specifies the number of electrified end uses we expect to be installed in New England in 2040. And this includes everything from lighting to laundry to electric vehicles. The most important of those numbers is that we assume 1.46 million residential heat pumps will be installed in New England's 5.9 million residential buildings, and that about 8% of commercial space heating capacity will be met with cold climate heat pumps. So winter peaks have historically accompanied periods of deep or extended cold. So we expose our electrified New England to a real cold weather event, a 4-day polar vortex that hit the region in January 2019. You can see the hourly temperatures there on the left. We use that to calculate hourly heating demand. Then we use the performance of our building's heating equipment to translate that into an hourly regional electric load, which you see there on the right. We pulled this together using a combination of data sources, the most important of which are listed on the bottom of the slide. I'll note that the dark red layer at the bottom and the pink layer at the top are residential and commercial space heating, respectively. And it becomes immediately clear that space heating is the overwhelming driver of peak and that the residential contribution is larger than the commercial. And let me also note that this load profile includes all residential loads, most common commercial loads, but no industrial load. So next we ask, how much savings can demand-side management give us? Like, given this load profile, how much peak can DSM shave away? And we answer this question with 3 different packages of demand-side measures. All of these packages are based leveraging the utility program examples that Charlotte collected. We were able to extrapolate what existing utility programs would be able to accomplish in 2040 if things continued in a business as usual manner. And we call this our standard package. Then we add on some grid interactive efficient buildings, some GEB measures, including smart thermostats and demand flexibility in what we call our smart package. And then our final package, the deep package, contains an ambitious but plausible set of measures that push energy efficiency and demand response to the next level. Here are some quick results. The dotted line on the right represents the original load, and the red, yellow, and blue layers represent the space heating, electric vehicle, and water heating loads after applying the demand-side measures. The gray layer is all other loads. We find that continuing demand-side management business as usual could deliver peak reduction savings of between 6 and 7% for this modeled case. If we were to add in smart thermostats, demand response, and other GEB measures, peak savings rise up to about 12%. And if we deploy all of our measures in our D package, we would be able to reduce peak by about 34%. You'll also notice here that the water heating and EV profiles become a bit more irregular, and that's a result of demand response being deployed to flatten local peaks. But what measures are yielding the greatest savings? Simply put, and by a large margin, those that reduce heating load. And of those, residential weatherization, shown here in light blue, lowered peak the most. Following that was improved cold climate air source heat pump performance, shown here in red. And we also found that this measure grew in importance as the number of heat pumps in our simulation increased and as temperature decreased. We found that intelligent operation of heating equipment through residential smart thermostats, advanced rooftop controls in commercial buildings, and energy information management systems, shown in green generally, can reduce winter peak to a lesser but still significant extent. And finally, we modeled what would happen if instead of heat pumps defaulting to electric resistance backup heating, they instead switched over to fossil backup during the very coldest periods, and found that the possibility of using limited natural gas, propane, or the like could be valuable in terms of reducing the amount of electric capacity needed to deal with the most intense winter peaks. And you can see here on the right how the fossil backup took just a giant chunk out of peak load that was otherwise up near about 34 gigawatts. And it brought it down to a level that's actually lower than current winter peak demand in New England. And lastly, I'll just close with some recommendations for key stakeholders. I encourage everyone, take a look through the report to see these in detail. But in short, we recommend the creation of requirements for utilities to establish winter peak demand reduction goals in regions with the potential to become winter peaking in the future. For them to consider the full suite of demand-side measures right alongside supply-side options includes the benefits that they'll be able to offer for winter peaks. For utilities and program administrators, our recommendations begin with just understanding the drivers of winter peaks in your region, and then evolve your existing DSM programs to specifically target winter peak demand reduction. From a measures basis, we recommend expanding weatherization and home retrofit programs. And if you're planning to incentivize the adoption of heat pumps, consider promoting higher efficiency models and in ways that could accelerate and transform the market. We make additional recommendations about the integration of demand response technologies and marketing and outreach efforts as well. I'll leave that to your individual reading. And with that, Dan, I will throw it back to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. That gave a great viewpoint of what to possibly to expect and how we might deal with it. Our next speaker is Maggie Shower, who will give us a perspective on what's happening down in the Southeast. Maggie?
Hi, thank you, Dan, and thank you, Mike, and thanks for having me on. This is a hugely important topic and a great report, and I'm happy to be here and participating. So I'm here to provide a little bit of perspective from a different region, the Southeast, which, like all regions, is unique. And in the Southeast, most of the peak load occurs in the summer. However, we look utility region to utility region, there are some utilities that experience some winter peaks, and the winter time can tend to be peakier than in the summertime in the Southeast. A lot of this is driven by having both air conditioning load and electric heating load. So in the Southeast, we are experiencing, in some of these utilities, a different phenomenon. Rather than trying to electrify heating and space and water heating, we have some regions that are, have a pretty high prevalence of electric resistance heating, and that can drive winter peaks. However, it's not so unique. A lot of the solutions that were looked at and work in the New England example would also work in the Southeast, where instead of moving heating into electrifying heating, we are looking to move from inefficient electric heating to a more efficient option. And because a number of our utilities are dual peaking or are still focused on a summer peak, they're mainly a peaker summer peaking region, there is the ability for these programs and these solutions, such as weatherization, such as heat pumps, to help both winter peak and summer. And this particular point is really important because in the Southeast, the states in the Southeast have some of the highest energy burdens across the country. Energy burden being the amount of a household's income that it spends on energy related expenses through the month or the year. And a lot of these high energy burdens are driven by high electricity across the Southeast. We see this in both rural and metropolitan areas. So that means that there is a huge potential for weatherization and efficient heat pumps and the like to help with both summer, winter peak that would also help with high customer costs during these seasons. So historically, the Southeast and both the Southeast utilities and the Southeastern states, we've not really been that strong on energy efficiency. And so, again, we're just really excited by the solutions presented in this report and some of those that were explored in Duke Energy's report, which we'll hear from Tom about in a minute. And all of these are huge opportunities to help ease energy burdens in the Southeast, drive jobs and economic growth, and reduce pollution. So we're seeing this as a win-win-win and looking forward to working with utilities, states, and cities to both put these programs in place, expand these programs where they exist, and see this through to fruition.
All right, thank you very much, Maggie. That was great. So now we drill down even a little deeper and taking a look at what Southern Utility has been looking at in terms of winter peaks and how they might meet that in the future. So Tom, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Maggie. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and also really thank Mike and everyone, the whole team at ACEEE, for a really very timely research report and webinar. It's an important topic that is clearly emerging in our industry. So for my comments today, I'm going to be focusing, as we talked about, on the recent winter peak study that my company, Tierra, completed for Duke Energy. We had support from Dunsky Energy Consulting and Procter Engineering for the study. The study looked at targeted winter peak energy efficiency and overall demand response, demand side management opportunities in Duke's North and South Carolina territories. So today I'm going to give kind of a brief overview of what were the drivers for this study, what are some of the key learnings that we found, and how could these be applied maybe for other practitioners. But before I dive in, I did want to take a moment to acknowledge Lon Huber at Duke. He's been the sponsor of this study, and he really had the foresight to recognize this as an emerging issue and to proactively collaborate with stakeholders starting almost 2 years ago, year and a half ago. Very thoughtful leadership there on your part, Lon, so I appreciate that. And so, like I said, I want to now dive in a little bit more about what we learned in the study, and first a little bit about what drove the study itself. So as Mike did a great job framing up at Dan, the loads in North and South Carolina are changing. So Duke embarked on its 2020 IRP proceeding. And if you look at Duke's load forecast and you look out into the future, they predict that their region, which has historically always been a winter peak service territory in North and South Carolina, is actually becoming a dual peak right now. It is almost an identical winter and summer peak today. But if you look at the planning horizon, you'll see that it's really becoming dominated by winter peaks. And I really wanted to drill down a little bit. I think Mike had some good points about electrification. But I think in Duke's case, what's really driven it is the penetration of grid scale and distributed solar resources. And so if you think about Duke's service territory and climate, and you think about solar production, the solar production curve helps you in the summertime when you're talking about afternoon peaks, which are somewhat going to be occurring a little bit later than peak solar production, but you still have quite a bit of solar resource on the grid during your peak. If you think about Duke's winter peak needs, they are a dual peaker in the winter, but the morning peak is much more of a concern. And in that morning peak, as you can imagine, their morning peak is between 7 and 9 p.m. on weekdays, or 7 and 9 a.m. on weekdays. And during that 2-hour time frame, as you can imagine, there's really not much solar being produced. And so if you look at the IRP forecast and you look at the base case with carbon policy scenario, it forecasts that in 2035, there's actually a gap of about 1,200 megawatts between summer and winter peak solar generation capacity. So you can see where that's driving as Duke continues, that service territory continues to grow. What they're finding is that summer peaks are not growing nearly as quickly as winter peaks are in terms of net loads due to the impact of solar. So this is a great thing for clean energy, but it's a real emerging issue that I think we need to address. And then if you think about the other side of it, Duke's historically, their DSM programs have focused on summer peak because that's been their issue. And so if we look today, there's a gap of about 1,000 megawatts between Duke's resources from energy efficiency, DSM, demand response in the summer, and what those kind of programs deliver today in the winter. So it's clear that we need to kind of start thinking proactively about solving that upcoming challenge in winter and really building out some winter peak targeted DSM. So that's what kind of drove the study. And then in terms of how we approached the study, very similar in some ways to how ACEEE approached it more on a national basis. We wanted to really start by thinking about what characterizing Duke's winter peak loads, because we wanted to make sure that we were really driving at the loads that matter in terms of what program designs we were thinking about. And so we looked at segments, end uses, and technologies that were really driving coincident winter peak loads, again, between, say, 6 to 9, 7 to 9 a.m. on winter mornings. And so, so that was how we started, with a deeper dive into that. Obviously, load forecast has a lot of that, but we wanted to get deeper. And then secondly, what were market potential of DSM opportunities? And then finally, as opposed to a lot of market potential studies stop there, and what we did is actually derive a lot of concepts and a winter peak solution set. It included a list of 17 different DSM programs, a lot of the same programs and opportunities that ACEEE identified, including, but really focused on loads that matter, and not surprisingly, space heat and residential space heat, particularly in the Southeast, where there is a lot of electrified heating already. And water heating were certainly big loads, and then similarly commercial heating loads. So just have a few minutes to talk about a really broad study. So I wanted to kind of jump into some key lessons and findings, and some maybe things that people can carry to other areas. First of all, there's clearly a lot of nascent winter peak DSM available. Our forecast is that by 2040, we could incrementally provide between 1,100 and 1,400 megawatts of winter peak targeted DSM that would help to solve those winter peak capacity needs. So a significant resource that we can bring to bear, but it's clearly nascent, right? And there's clearly more work that needs to be done, and I'm going to touch on a couple of research topics I think are important. But first, as we talked about, focus on the loads and the segments that matter. So we did a lot of work really thinking about what is coincident to winter peaks, and what are the drivers for customer interest in DSM programs, and what are some of the roadblocks and barriers to participation, particularly when you think about thermal envelope and HVAC improvements that can be rather expensive in terms of upfront costs. Second is, let's be sure we leverage everything we're currently doing. With all of the experience we have on summer peak DSM, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. We need to consider how current delivery channels, current trade allies, and current program designs can be evolved. And Allison pointed out when we were talking the other day, right, something that we note, which is what about programs and opportunities like HVAC and like thermal envelope improvements that can provide both summer and winter peak savings? Gives us a real opportunity to engage customers with more savings opportunities, engage trade allies, and finally make programs more cost effective. In doing that, don't forget about emerging new loads and technologies, in particular EV charging that Mike brought up a little bit. We really focused on workplace EV charging, because thinking about that 7 to 9 a.m., hopefully we'll all get back to working in offices soon, and customers are going to have a tendency to plug in when they get to the office. And then thinking about how batteries can help us as well. We took a very holistic approach. We combined advanced rates, tariffs, things like critical peak pricing, peak time rebates, TOU options with DSM programs. And we feel like if you can combine enabling technologies like smart thermostats and water heating controls with attractive rate designs for customers, you can really drive a lot of ongoing savings. The other thing that Maggie brought up is that we really need to focus on bringing along some of those harder to reach segments, and in particular mobile homes, manufactured housing in the Southeast, typically all electric resistance heating, maybe not the best thermal envelopes. There's a lot of opportunity there to help with energy burden and also help with very peak loads. And then finally, I'll just close by saying that we do need more research in this area. What happens with winter, with heat pump heat strips when we start to do load shifting and demand response? How can we help those hard to reach segments? And then finally, the one that has come up quite a bit is space heating, right? There are things like space heaters that if we're doing demand response with customers, we need to make sure that they're not shifting to a less efficient heating load in order to, improve comfort on those cold mornings. So we have to think about comfort and alternative heat sources as well. I know that was a ton to cram in, but hopefully some useful info. And I'd be happy to answer any questions either during or after the session. And I'll turn it back to you. Thanks, everybody.
Great. All right. Wonderful, Tom. Thank you. All right, and now we turn a little bit towards the west to look at what happened in Texas, and Allison's going to take us through that. Here you go, Allison.
And my camera seems to be stuck. Can you see my camera, or can you just ignore it and we'll look at my slides?
I'm seeing you, and I'm seeing the slides.
Okay,
so.
then I will ignore that and just start talking. Thank you. So I want to talk about what happened in Lynn. Next slide, please. In Texas. I love the idea that Texas is the West. Thank you for that. I started thinking through this excellent study. Thank you all for including me in this event, by the way. I started by thinking through the key points of the study. So this is just a summary that I developed based on the study summary, just to remind myself what it is y'all focused on and to give me some focus opportunities for this conversation. And two of the most important ideas that popped out to me were to use residential weatherization as the largest impact on peak reduction, and demand measures that reduce heating load are the best ways to manage winter peak demand. So next slide, please. We are now at the looking beyond New England. Oh, go back to the New England page. Oh, okay, thank you. I can't tell what it is I'm supposed to look at. The ERCOT event illustrates pretty painfully what happens when you cannot meet winter peak. And this event actually began on the power went out on around 1:23. We started getting load shed on February 15, but the Arctic event began for us here in Texas on February 11. And sub-freezing temperatures continued through February 18. I probably don't need to tell most of you that Texas facilities, housing, power plants, et cetera, are designed more for heat than for cold. ERCOT began cutting load around 12:30, 12:45 on the morning of Monday, February 15, and ended up cutting 20.5 gigawatts of load after 53 gigawatts of generation failed under bitterly cold weather. The causes of those failures, this represents the 53 gigawatt nameplate capacity, which means that you don't count all of the wind and solar as what we were expecting to operate. But on the other hand, close to half of the fossil generation and nuclear capability inside Texas disappeared. And that led to 4.5 million customer accounts out of power that were cut by ERCOT instructions to their transmission and distribution utilities. That was 69% of all Texans who were out of power for an average of 42 hours. And most of that, although the utility intention is if you have to cut load, God forbid, you do it on a rotating outage basis so that you turn one hunk of circuits out for a couple hours and then you rotate it to the next group of people and so on and so forth. So nobody gets too cold for too long. Well, in this case, everybody got way too cold for way too long because the rotating was not possible. The consequences of this disaster were that almost half of all Texans lost access to running water or drinkable water, difficulty obtaining food and groceries due to the water freezes, because the water our pipes are in too many uninsulated homes, so the water pipes freeze, and when they start unfreezing, they burst. Houston, which is one of the largest cities in the nation, was hit far harder than other areas for reasons that escape me. All of the folks who were hardest hit were low-income Texans because their homes are energy inefficient. They have terrible heaters. They couldn't buy enough food to protect themselves beforehand or replace the food that they lost or buy bottled water or escape to powered locations to stay warm. And unfortunately, over 200 people died from this event, many of them inside homes. Many of them died were homeless or they were in car accidents or whatever, but too many people died inside their homes due to carbon monoxide poisoning or hypothermia. And there were billions and billions of dollars in damages. Next slide, please. So that's what happens when you screw this up, which is what makes the report from ACEEE team so timely. Now, what caused this? Heating and housing in Texas, and is a huge contributor to this. We've had massive housing construction in the last 2 decades. Most of it has electric heating. Many of these are very inefficient resistance heating or heat pumps that were not designed for cold weather because, again, we're a summer peaking state. It gets hot or really hot, and so we don't build stuff intended to keep, we don't plan for, we care a lot more about air conditioning than we do about heating. We have sad, inadequate energy efficiency requirements, and most of those were not put in place. We didn't adopt any kind of building code until around 2001. As a consequence, way too many Texas homes are poorly insulated and leak warm air. Put all that together, Professor Davis at the Haas Institute did the math and estimates that 7 million homes with inefficient electric heating on the night of the 14th could have added up to 35 gig of load. That would equal 45%, or close to half of the potential peak load that ERCOT generation was trying to meet and failing on the night before they started shedding load. And it greatly exceeds the amount of load that ERCOT actually cut, which was 20.5 gig. In other words, if we could cut, whoa, back up 1 more second, please, on that slide. So if we could cut, thank you, if we could cut that load down through greater efficiency and other measures, ERCOT might not have had to cut that load. Now we all know energy efficiency is like planting a tree. The best time to do it is 20 years ago. The next best time to do it is right this minute. Now we can go to the next slide, please, Lynn. Thank you. So let me talk for a minute about concerns on winter peaks and broadly from the grid operations perspective. We all know electrification is putting more burden on the grid, and grid management will become more challenging with higher renewables and less fossil generation. Texas illustrates the consequences of something that the electric industry has grossly underassessed and underplanned for, which is common failure causes. In this case, the bitter cold and bitter wind caused every kind of failure imaginable. Every type of power plant, every type of fuel was affected. The winds and the cold took out transmission lines. They took out distribution lines because of some of the storms that preceded the snow and wind and icing that preceded the particular power shutoffs. And Texas also illustrates the miseries caused by the interdependence of all of these critical systems: water, wastewater, roads, electricity, communications. We managed to screw up all of that. You can't fix a power plant when you can't get parts in or when you can't get workers in. You can't operate a gas compressor system, a gas pipeline system if you are powering your compressor stations with electricity from the grid, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly, electrification is just going to raise the stakes on all of that and increase the consequences of grid failure regardless of the cost. Next, please. Here's the quick, cheap summary of the distinction between reliability and resilience. I think of reliability as what are all the things that we do to keep the lights on? And I think of resilience as how do we reduce the consequences of and recover quickly from a failure by the grid. But resilience is broader than just the grid. Resilience is about communities, it's about people, it's about society as well as the grid itself. Measures that reduce peak will help grid reliability by reducing the challenge of finding enough supply to meet the demand. And things like heat pumps and building envelope improvement, and I'm going to take and demand flexibility, I'll do that in terms of improving reliability. I want to take a quick side trip and note that I'm going to talk consistently about building envelope improvement rather than weatherization, because way too many, particularly low-income houses, have holes in the ceiling, in the windows, whatever, so it's not enough just to weatherize, you have to fix stuff too. Measures that create demand flexibility are good for operational reliability and resilience, and help to integrate renewable generation, which is where we're going and why we want to electrify in the first place. But building envelope improvement is going to reduce our overall reliance on electricity and protect humans, not just the grid. And that protects our communities and our personal well-being and not just the grid. I mean, the grid is there to serve us. We're not just side collateral. Next, please. So the best, and the other reason that I'm going to talk about the measures on this closing slide are, remember that 95% of customer outages are due to failures at the distribution level, not due to loss of generation or loss of transmission. So I want to encourage you to focus on the measures that protect people and that make the grid work least. The best demand-side solutions in my mind are those that create load that I never have to serve. And the next best make load manageable to help the grid supply work better. So we face an extraordinary set of threats in every possible way. Don't just install devices that protect us against one or two threats. Look for options that will deliver value and protect all of us under multiple threat conditions. My preferences are do building envelope improvements first and foremost and do them in a huge way. We need a massive retrofit effort to help low-income and multifamily housing because that is where the need is. It will create massive jobs. It will address equity problems, and it will also save us a heck of a lot of electricity in doing so. Second is go for the things like thermostats and controls for HVAC and water heaters to enable demand shifting, net load ramping, and ancillary services provisions that will allow us, instead of managing supply to meet variable demand, the vision that we should have going forward is to design a grid where we manage demand to meet variable supply, to balance it more effectively so that these work together rather than one being a servant of the other. And then, although I know that on paper your study says heat pumps are the best way to reduce peak, heat pumps fail when the grid goes off. So simply improving a heat pump or the heating space conditioning method for a building envelope that is leaking isn't going to keep people alive when your grid fails. And it won't enable you to do as good a job at things like cycling to protect everybody when you have more grid emergencies. So all of the measures that I'm recommending, particularly building heat envelope improvements first and foremost, as well as the addressable thermostats and controls, will offer maximum value under all circumstances, peak and operations, winter or summer, and help protect customers and not just the grid. So thanks.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Allison. All right. Now we've got a little time here for a few questions and answers. Before I get to that, just a couple things. One, there have been several questions about both the slides and the report. We'll be making those available. The reports, if you just go to ACEEE's website and on publications, you'll find a link to be able to download the report just released today. Also, I know we're not going to get to all the questions during this maybe 10, 12 minutes remaining, so we will try to follow up with those as we can. We can record those from this platform. So with that, I'm just going to pick up on something Allison ended on, just noting the importance of building shell improvements, improving that thermal performance. And this will be directed a little, probably more to Maggie and Tom, looking at Paul. So here's the question. Given that the move towards electrification and installation of heat pumps risks creating problems and higher costs by driving up winter electric peak demand, what policies and programs could help ensure that heat pump installation is coupled with improvements in building shell efficiency? And Maggie, do you want to take a first crack at that?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Thanks for the question. And I agree with kind of the order that Allison laid it out. And I think, you know, from some of the charts that Mike showed, it was pretty clear that what we do on building envelope improvements and weatherization go hand in hand with also installing pumps And I think that it also depends on what you're replacing. What happens to the winter peak if you're replacing a direct fossil combustion heating system. Obviously, that's going to add load. Whereas, from the Southeast perspective, a lot of times you're replacing electric resistance heating, and you're going to get gain. You're going to see lower winter peaks from that switch. So I think that it's twofold, looking at what you're replacing and also absolutely doing more than just installing a heat pump.
Very good. Tom, how about program perspectives? How you design those programs to do both?
Yeah, Dan, and I alluded to this earlier, and I think that it's super important when we think about particular housing stock in the Duke territory and throughout the Southeast. There's a decent amount of manufactured housing and mobile homes that have substandard thermal envelopes. And so they also typically have electric resistance heating. And so when we look at profiles of loads, those homes are incredibly peaky in the heating season. And so they're going to drive the utilities' winter peaks more, and they're also going to drive bill impacts for those customers that, may be a more limited income situation. So, I really appreciated a lot of Allison's remarks and around let's really focus on the things that matter and have value to customers. And then I think also when we think about, I'm a big believer in load flexibility. And what comes with that, I think, is the need for resiliency that allows my structure that I live in to have greater load flexibility, less need for frequent inputs of energy to maintain comfort. And so in a world where we like to think about gadgets and technologies, we do have to think about the foundation of programs being keeping folks comfortable and a reasonable energy cost. And a lot of times that is not going to be achieved without thinking about thermal envelope first. I think the challenges there are that it's not the most cost-effective improvement a lot of times. So I think we need to really challenge ourselves for efficient ways of doing that work and ways that we're grabbing the right set of benefits to really, to justify the value that we know that's there.
Very good. All right, here's a question for Mike. I think on this study, but others are welcome to jump in on this too. How does the cost of the deep DSM options compare to the cost of expanding the grid, generation, transmission, and distribution? So I guess Mike speak to that in terms of our study, but I think some of the rest of you might have something to contribute there as well.
Yeah, let me just start with saying a few words. I have a bonus slide on this that I can pull up. I think there it comes right there. Yeah, so we took a look at costs in the context of the New England case. I will give the caveat that this is a difficult question to answer when you're trying to do a simulation 20 years in the future. But what you see right here on this figure is a comparison of the levelized cost of electricity at the wholesale level during winter peak periods in New England right now, along with the program administrator cost of saved energy for various energy-saving DSMs. And these values are based on an aggregated average of program costs and savings on a national level. And, we can compare these values with, a 15-year levelized cost of electricity during a regular winter peak. And there are cost calculators, including from Synapse, that allow you to do something like this. But the caveat is that there are so many benefits that come from demand-side measures, and it depends, strongly on what's happening on what's your generation look like, what kind of avoided T&D costs can you get, what's your savings in energy. So while we know that there is a history of demand-side measures delivering cost savings, often as the lowest cost resource, and since we are also calling for an evolution of existing programs and leveraging what you've already done and evolving it to the winter context, we have every reason to believe that it's going to remain cost effective. This chart just gives a small sample of that, and I encourage you to look at more of this in the report. But if you want to answer it 20 years in the future, it does become a little bit more of a challenging issue, which the current cost calculators can't really get too far on yet. But it's a very important question.
Very good. Any other panelists want to take a crack at that one?
This is Allison.
Yeah.
One of the issues that we have is that I think we need to update the nature of cost-benefit tests for a new reality. We are grossly underestimating the benefits of energy efficiency and other measures, and that leads to over-rigid, under-generous realities about what programmatically can be justified. And so this is something that would benefit from deep thinking by folks on this call, including the excellent ACEEE staff. So, you know, we just don't count human life and human health, for instance. We only count kilowatt hours and BTUs today, and that's just ridiculous.
Well, here's a question that just is a perfect add-in to this. Can any of the panelists speak to examples of energy efficiency program administrators identifying and or quantifying resilience benefits in their cost effectiveness tests?
No.
Or Tom or anyone else seen that? Okay.
Yeah, I think sadly no. It's a tough question to answer, right? And so I think we tend to go back to the same tools we've used and the same streams of avoided cost benefits. And I couldn't agree more with Allison that we really need to take a different look at that, as well as think about not only programmatic, but how can rates and tariffs help customers, reward customers who can be flexible in the way they use energy, and then help those customers with sensible education and EE that helps back up that resiliency and that flexibility.
And I can also add on the resilience question, there hasn't been a lot of work done on this, but I think in 2019 or last year, Caillou Sun was the lead author on a paper at LBNL that examined kind of the converse event where during Hurricane Irma, a tree branch hit a transformer, knocked out the air conditioning system for a nursing home in Hollywood, Florida. And they modeled the entire building in energy modeling software and then started to put in various demand side measures, keeping track of the costs, and then seeing how that affected the indoor temperature. And what they found is that very inexpensive passive energy efficiency measures are incredibly cost effective when it comes to like saving life. So if people are interested in that particular study, I'm happy to forward it to you. But it's the same thing. It's the analog in the summer for the winter. But more research needs to be done on this because it is systematically undervalued component of energy efficiency.
Very good. All right. Here's a question. It was directed to Tom on Duke. Is Duke considering support to grow the market for heat pumps in their territories? What kind of incentives, outreach, and education? But I'd also open that more broadly to the other panelists just to see what kind of support they see needed for heat pump market penetration, as well as commenting on maybe the barriers and the speed at which this market will be penetrated, because there's clearly, I'm in Wisconsin, there's we get real nervous about super cold weather and wondering will this new technology cut it when it's minus 30 out. So just what's needed to grow this market and what might be holding it back? I mean, maybe Tom, start with you.
Yeah, I'll start, and I'll be pretty quick because I think in Duke's territory, right, we see some parts of the territory that are all electric. Overall, you see, more than 50%, 60% electric heating, right? And so there are already a ton of heat pumps in that territory. And I think Maggie said it best in terms of the Southeast. It's often now a case of substituting more efficiency, actually, as we think about that replacement cycle, right? And the challenge there is that replacement cycle is fairly long and the upfront cost is expensive, right? So it is going to take some time. Duke's been doing a lot of work around cold climate heat pumps. So thinking about how we can reduce that heat strip usage and really focusing on, those new technologies that can replace existing heat pumps that become a lot less peakier in the winter.
Anyone else? Our time is getting short, but anyone else want to weigh in on that question? All right. If not, I think we do need to start wrapping up. I will note I saw several questions come in about transportation. Our study did not look at transportation. I know we're doing other work in that area. But I do want to give each panelist, a 30-second closing comment, and then we'll wrap it up for today. And again, for those of you who submitted questions that didn't get answered, we'll try to capture those and follow up with you. And you're welcome to contact us. So starting with Mike, any last thought?
I just want to thank everyone at ACEEE, and we had a ton of reviewers and people that we interviewed for this process. So we acknowledge all of them, but this is not just the work of us. It is expert consensus brought in by others. So I just want to give a thank you to everyone who helped out along the way and made this, I think, a really strong research product.
Very good. Thank you. Maggie?
Also, just thanks to ACEEE and everyone that worked on this report. I think that this will be a very key resource for us in our work across the Southeast as we talk to utilities and state policymakers on putting these in place.
All right. And Tom?
Yeah, I'd just also like to give a shout out to ACEEE. Great research and great webinar, guys. And also, for anyone who's interested, there are, I guess I heard from one of my team and they put a link to some of the Duke reports that we created in the chat. So if anyone's interested, I think there's a link there that you can access those reports. Thanks, everybody.
All right. And Allison, I'll give you the last word here before we wrap up.
Thank you. Again, props to the ACEEE team. This is an important and timely piece of work, and moving these issues forward. And I also want to thank you all for including me. Most organizations think board members should be seen and not heard, and I appreciate y'all giving me the opportunity to be heard. Thank you. Y'all have a great day, and thank you for putting all this, everyone who's listening, for taking part in this and moving these ideas forward within the industry for all the people whom we serve.
Very good. And with that, thank all of you for participating, and we'll close the webinar now. Enjoy the rest of your days. Bye-bye.